there's a huge debate. Before we set up Quilliam, there were two main schools of thought around this subject. And they can be caricatured, and I say caricatured, forgive me for the generalization, but they can be caricatured as those who blamed terrorism, blamed Islam itself as being responsible for terrorism, and the other school of thought, which are those who blamed everything entirely on the West. And there are caricatures in terms of individuals who represent both of those schools of thought. Those who want to say that the problem is with the faith of Islam itself, and those who want to blame everything on Britain, America, and Europe. We came along and we tried to give a more nuanced perspective. And what we said was that no faith is responsible entirely for the world's problems. Faiths can be interpreted and have been interpreted in many ways. Islam, like Christianity, can be interpreted in a plethora of ways. So we use the phrase Islamism. And what we mean by Islamism, to give a very one-sentence basic definition, Islamism is the desire to impose an interpretation of Islam over society by state law, using legislation. Islamists can be non-violent, and they can be violent, and they can be terrorists. But the ideology is the same, and that's the desire to impose an interpretation of Islam as state law over everybody else. And that's the crucial difference between Islam as a faith, which can mean anything to any Muslim, and Islamism, the modern political ideology. Islamism emerged in Egypt in 1928 with the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood, but there are many, many organizations and many schools of thought within the Islamist ideology. Like with communism, it's the same thing.
Now, of course, irrespective of the differences you've cited there, for many people, particularly in the West, Muslims are scary people. How do we counter that stereotype? It's a hard one to shift.
There is that stereotype, like there is in, say, I also work in Pakistan, and there's a stereotype that Americans are scary people. And so we have to... and we have to be... it's very difficult. But what I try and do is, and I spoke just... before coming here, I spoke at Oxford University, and what I did there was focus on what people, the audience I was addressing, can do to challenge these negative stereotypes themselves. When I go to Pakistan, I focus on what Pakistanis can do. So those two ingredients are crucial. What we can do in Europe, European Muslims first of all, Muslims born and raised in Europe, they need to do more, frankly, to challenge extremism within their own communities. But they need to do it, by doing it themselves, they will be the best evidence that the problem isn't simply because they're Muslims. Because you'll have Muslims coming forward to challenge extremism. So if I'm sitting here in front of you and saying, I'm someone who's a Muslim, albeit not devout, but I am a Muslim, and I'm challenging extremism and saying the problem isn't with Islam, but it's with Islamism, optically, that's a powerful message to those who may have a problem with Islam itself, because they see more and more Muslims doing that. As for non-Muslim European society, then there are issues they need to address as well. One of the things they need to address revolves around identity. Identity is crucial in this debate. It leads to many European born and raised Muslims moving towards extremism because they experience an identity crisis. But mainstream European society is also suffering from an identity crisis. What does it mean to be European in this modern globalized world? What does it mean to be German? What does it mean to be Dutch? We know, for example, what it means to be American. You can be American Italian, you can be American Cuban, you can be American Muslim, you can be American Jewish. We know in Britain, increasingly these days, you can be British Pakistani, British Scots, British Welsh, British English. But in Germany, in Denmark, in Holland, this question is still being debated. Is Dutch, Danish, and German, are they ethnic terms? Do they denote ethnicity? Or are they citizenships? And that identity crisis needs to be resolved in Europe.
Now, one thing, though, is there's a big problem with people generalizing when it comes to Islam and describing, for example, the political and social issues in the Arab world as primarily a Muslim problem. And they blame religion for many issues that come up because of society and because of that may also exist in many non-Muslim countries. I mean, Islam certainly doesn't have a monopoly on dictators and hardline rulers. So I wonder how much, with the work that Quilliam does, you actually try to counter these stereotypes where people use expressions such as the problem with the Muslim world.
That's a huge, and I'm really happy you asked that question, that's a huge problem, one of language. We've released a briefing paper, for example, addressing language. People generalize and they call Egypt, for example, they would call it a Muslim country. Well, first of all, there are 20% of Egyptians are Coptic Christians. Many people may not know that. to call Egypt a Muslim country actually surrenders, no matter what our intent is, it surrenders the country to the Islamist agenda, which seeks to define Egypt by one identity alone, and that's the faith identity, and in this case, the faith of Islam. And what that can do is then spiral to a point where if Egypt's a Muslim country, well, it needs to be a better Muslim country. And the way to be a better Muslim country is to become an Islamic state. Actually, Egypt is a republic, and it's a republic for all Egyptians. And as the uprising has demonstrated, all of these Egyptians want to live together as Egyptian citizens. We can't have it both ways. We can't, on the one hand, complain that the EU is a Christian club and it should allow, for example, Turkey in, or those who do complain, and call for more citizenship in Europe, yet at the same time very lazily abandon that threshold, abandon that criteria when referring to Muslim majority countries, and lazily call them Muslim countries.